Welcome back. We're on chapter 47. A Path Revealed. Last chapter we were reading Eragon, Murtaugh, and Saphira had just seen the Bear Mountains. Beor. I don't know. I always pronounce it differently. We'll go with the Bear Mountains. And we're riding into them. Fatigued and haggard, but with triumphant smiles, they sat around the fire, congratulating each other. Saphira crowed jubilantly, which startled the horses. Eragon stared at the flames. He was proud that they had covered roughly 60 leagues in 5 days. It was an impressive feat, even for a rider, able to change mounts regularly. I'm outside of the Empire. It was a strange thought. He had been born in the Empire, lived his entire life under Galbatorix's rule, lost his closest friends and family to the king's servants, and had nearly died several times within his domain. Now Eragon was free. No more would he and Saphira have to dodge the soldiers, avoid towns, or hide who they were. It was a bittersweet realization, for the cost had been the loss of his entire world. He looked at the stars in the gloaming sky, and through the thought of the building, and though he thought of building a home in the safety of isolation, it appealed to him. He had witnessed too many wrongs committed in Galbatorix's name, from murder to slavery, to turn his back on the Empire. No longer was it just vengeance for Brahm's death as well as Garrow's that drove him. As a rider, it was his duty to assist those without strength to resist Galbatorix's oppression. With a sigh, he abandoned his deliberation and observed the elf stretched out by Saphira. The fire's orange light gave her face a warm cast. Smooth shadows flickered under her cheekbones. As he stared, an idea slowly came to him. He could hear the thoughts of people and animals, and communicate with them in that manner if he chose to, but it was something he had done infrequently, except with Saphira. He always remembered Brahm's admonishment not to violate somebody's mind unless absolutely necessary. Save for the one time he had tried to probe Murtaugh's consciousness, he had refrained from doing so. However, now, he wondered if it were possible to contact the elf in her comatose state. I might be able to learn from her memories why she remains like this, but if she recovers, would she forgive me for such an intrusion? Whether she does or not, I must try. She's been in this condition for almost a week. Without speaking of his intentions to Murtaugh or Saphira, he knelt by the elf and placed his palm on her brow. Eragon closed his eyes and extended a tendril of thought, like a probing finger towards the elf's mind. He found it without difficulty. It was not fuzzy and filled with pain as he had anticipated, but lucid and clear, like a note from a crystal ball. Suddenly an icy dagger drove into his mind. Pain exploded behind his eyes in splashes of color. He recoiled from the attack, but found himself held in an iron grip, unable to retreat. Eragon fought as hard as he could to use every defense he could think of. The dagger stabbed into his mind again. He frantically threw his own barriers before it, blunting the attack. The pain was less excruciating than the first time, but it jarred his concentration. The elf took the opportunity to ruthlessly crush his defenses. A stifling blanket pressed down on Eragon from all directions, smoldering his thoughts. The overpowering force slowly contracted, squeezing the life out of him bit by bit, though he held on, unwilling to give up. The elf tightened her relentless grip even more, as to extinguish him like a snuffed candle. He desperately cried in the ancient language, Ek I fricka in Shirgal, I am a rider and a friend. The deadly embrace did not loosen its hold, but its constriction halted, and surprise emanated from her. Suspicion followed a second later, but he knew she would believe him. He could not have lied in the ancient language. However, while he said he was a friend, that did not mean he meant her no harm. For all she knew, Eragon believed himself to be her friend, making the statement true for him, though she might not consider him one. The ancient language does have its limitations, thought Eragon, hoping that the elf would be curious enough to risk freeing him. She was. The pressure lifted and the barriers around her mind hesitantly lowered. The elf warily let their thoughts touch, like two wild animals meeting for the first time. A cold shiver ran down Eragon's side. Her mind was alien. It felt vast and powerful, weighted with memories of uncounted years. Dark thoughts loomed out of sight and touch, artifacts of a race that made him cringe when they brushed his consciousness. Yet, through all the sensations shimmered a melody of wild, haunting beauty that embodied her identity. "What is your name?" she asked, speaking in the ancient language. Her voice was weary and filled with quiet despair. "Eragon. And yours?" Her consciousness lured him closer, inviting him to submerge himself in the lyric strains of her blood. He resisted the summons with difficulty, though his heart ached to accept it. For the first time he understood the fey attraction to elves. They were creatures of magic, unbound by the moral laws of the land, as different from humans as dragons were from animals. Let's see. "Araya, why have you contacted me in this matter? Am I still captive of the Empire?" "No, you are free," said Eragon, though he knew only scattered words in the ancient language. He managed to convey, "I was imprisoned in Gilead like you, but I escaped and rescued you. In the 5 days since we've crossed to the edge of the Hederic Desert, you are now encamped by the Boar Mountains. You've not stirred nor said a word in all that time." "Ah, so it was Gilead." She paused. "I know that my wounds were healed. At the time, I did not understand why. Preparation for some new torture, I was certain. Now I realize it was you." Softly she added, "Even so, I have not risen, and you are puzzled." "Yes. During my captivity, a rare poison, the skin la bras, was given to me, along with a drug to suppress my power. Every morning, the antidote for the previous day's poison was administered to me, by force if I refused to take it. Without it, I will die within a few hours. That is why I lie in this trance. It slows the Slinka's bronze progress, though it does not stop it. I contemplated waking for the purpose of ending my life and denying Galbatorix, but I refrained from doing so out of hope that you might be an ally." Her voice dwindled off weakly. "How long can you remain like this?" asked Eragon. "For weeks, but I'm afraid I haven't that much time. This dormancy cannot restrain death forever. I can feel it in my veins even now. Unless I receive the antidote, I will succumb to the poison in 3 or 4 days." "Where can the antidote be found?" "It exists in only 2 places outside of the Empire, with my own people and with the Varden. However, my home is beyond the reach of Drakenbeck." "What about the Varden? We could have taken you straight to them, but we don't know where they are." "I will tell you, if you give me your word that you will never reveal their location to Galbatorix, or anyone who serves him. In addition, you must swear that you have not deceived me in some manner, and that you intend no harm to the elves, dwarves, Varden, or the race of dragons." What Araya asked for would have been simple enough if they had not been conversing in the ancient language. Eragon knew she wanted oaths more binding than life itself. Once made, they could never be broken. That weighed heavily on him as he gravely pledged his word in agreement. "It is understood." A series of vertigo-inducing images suddenly flashed through his mind. He found himself riding along the bare mountain range, traveling eastward many leagues. Eragon did his best to remember the route as craggy mountains and hills flashed past. He was heading south now, still following the mountains. Then everything wheeled abruptly. He had entered a narrow, winding valley. It snaked through the mountains to the base of a frothy waterfall that pounded into a deep lake. The images stopped. "It is far," said Araya, "but do not let the distance dissuade you. When you arrive at Lake Koshtamerna, at the end of the Beartooth River, take a rock, bang on the cliff next to the waterfall, and cry, 'I, Varden, Arbdu Shurgols, Gatavata.' You will be admitted. You will be challenged, but do not falter, no matter how perilous it seems." "What should they give you for your poison?" he asked. Her voice quavered, but then she regained her strength. Tell them to give me Tunivor's nectar. You must leave me now. I have expended too much energy already. Do not talk with me again unless there is no hope of reaching the Varden. If that is the case, there is information I must impart to you to the Varden, so they will survive. Farewell, Eragon, rider of dragons. My life is in your hands. Araya withdrew from their contact. The unearthly strains that had been echoed across their link were gone. Eragon took a shuddering breath and forced his eyes open. Murtagh and Saphira stood on either side of him, watching with concern.
"Are you all right?"
asked Murtagh.
"You've been kneeling here for almost 15 minutes.
I have? Asked Eragon, blinking. Yes, in grimacing. Like a pained gargoyle, commented Saphira dryly. Eragon stood, wincing as his cramped knees stretched. I talk with Araya. Murtagh frowned quizzically, as if to inquire if he had gone mad. Eragon explained. The elf, that's her name. And what is it that ails her? Asked Saphira impatiently. Eragon swiftly told them of his entire discussion.
How far away are the Varden?
Asked Murtagh. I'm not exactly sure, confessed Eragon. From what she showed me, I think it's even farther than from here to Gilead.
And we're supposed to cover that in 3 to 4 days?
Demanded Murtagh angrily.
It took us 5 long days to get here. What do you want to do, kill the horses? They're exhausted as it is.
But if we do nothing, she'll die. If it's too much for the horses, Saphira can fly ahead with Araya and me. At least we would get to the Varden in time. You could catch up to us in a few days. Murtagh grunted and crossed his arms.
Of course. Murtagh the pack animal. Murtagh the horse leader. I should have remembered that's all I'm good for nowadays. Oh, and let's not forget, every soldier in the Empire is searching for me now because you couldn't defend yourself, and I had to go and save you. Yes. I suppose I'll just follow your instructions and bring up the horses in the rear like a good servant.
Eragon was bewildered by the sudden venom in Murtagh's voice. What's wrong with you? I'm grateful for what you did. There's no reason for you to be angry with me. I didn't ask you to accompany me or rescue me from Gilead. You chose that. I haven't forced you to do anything.
Oh, not openly. What else could I do but help you with the Razak?
And then later, at Gilead, how could I have left with a clear conscience?
The problem with you, said Murtagh, poking Eragon in the chest, is that you're totally hopeless, and you force everyone to take care of you.
The words stung Eragon's pride. He recognized a grain of truth in them. Don't touch me, he growled. Murtagh laughed, in a harsh tone in his voice.
Or what? You'll punch me? You couldn't hit a brick wall.
He went to shove Eragon again, but Eragon grabbed his arm and struck him in the stomach.
I said don't touch me!
Murtagh doubled over, swearing. Then he yelled and launched himself at Eragon. They fell in a tangle of arms and legs, pounding on each other. Eragon kicked at Murtagh's right hip, missed, and grazed the fire. Sparks and burning embers scattered through the air. They scrambled across the ground, trying to get leverage. Eragon managed to get his feet under Murtagh's chest and kicked mightily. Murtagh flew upside down over Eragon's head, landing flat on his back with a solid thump. Murtagh's breath whooshed out. He rolled stiffly to his feet, then wheeled to face Eragon, panting heavily. They charged each other once more. Saphira's tail slapped between them, accompanied by a deafening roar. Eragon ignored her and tried to jump over his tail, but a talon paw caught him in midair and flung him back to the ground. Enough! He futilely tried to push Saphira's muscled leg off his chest and saw that Murtagh was likewise pinned. Saphira roared again, snapping her jaws. She swung her head over Eragon and glared at him. You, of all people, should know better, fighting like starved dogs over a scrap of meat. What would Brahm say? Eragon felt his cheeks burn and averted his eyes. He knew what Brahm would have said. Saphira held them on the ground, letting them simmer. Then she said to Eragon poignantly, Now, if you don't want to spend the night under my foot, you will politely ask Murtagh what is troubling him. She snaked her head over to Murtagh and stared down at him with an impassive blue eye. And tell him that I won't stand for insults from either of you. Won't you let us up? Complained Eragon. No. Eragon reluctantly turned his head towards Murtagh, tasting blood in the side of his mouth. Murtagh avoided his eyes and looked up at the sky.
Well, is she gonna get off of us?
Not unless we talk. She wants me to ask you what's really the problem, said Eragon, embarrassed. Saphira growled an affirmative and continued to stare at Murtagh. It was impossible for him to escape her piercing glare. Finally, he shrugged, muttering something under his breath. Saphira's claws tightened on his chest, and her tail whistled through the air. Murtagh shot her an angry glance, then grudgingly said louder,
I told you before, I don't want to go to the Varden.
Eragon frowned. Was that all that's the matter? Don't want to or can't? Murtagh tried to shove Saphira's leg off him, then gave up with a curse.
Don't want to. They'll expect things from me that I can't deliver.
Did you steal something from them?
I wish it was that simple.
Eragon rolled his eyes, exasperated. Well, what is it then? Did you kill someone important or bed the wrong woman?
No, I was born,
said Murtagh cryptically. He pushed at Saphira again. This time she released them both. They got to their feet under her watchful eye and brushed dirt off their backs. So you're avoiding the question, Eragon said, dabbing his split lip.
So what?
Spat Murtagh as he stomped to the edge of the camp. After a minute he signaled,
It doesn't matter why I'm in this predicament, but I can tell you that the Varden wouldn't welcome me even if I came bearing the king's head. Oh, they might greet me nicely enough and let me into their councils, but trust me, never. And if I were to arrive under less fortunate circumstances, like the present ones, they'd likely clap me in irons.
Won't you tell me what this is about? Asked Eragon. I've done things I'm not proud of too. So it's not as if I'm going to pass judgment. Murtagh shook his head slowly, eyes glistening.
It isn't like that. I haven't done anything to deserve this treatment, though it would have been easier to atone for if I had. No, my only wrongdoing is existing in the first place.
He stopped and took a shaky breath.
You see, my father...
A sharp hiss from Saphira cut him off abruptly.
Look.
They followed her gaze westward. Murtagh's face paled.
Demons above and below.
A league away or so, parallel to the mountain range, was a column of figures marching east. The line of troops, hundreds strong, stretched for nearly a mile. Dust billowed from their heels. Their weapons glinted in the dying light. A standard-bearer rode before them in a black chariot, holding aloft a crimson banner.
It's the Empire, said Eragon tiredly. They found us somehow.
Saphira poked her head over his shoulder and gazed at the column.
Yes, but those are Urgals, not men, said Murtagh.
How can you tell?
Murtagh pointed at the standard. That flag bears the personal symbol of an Urgal chieftain. He's a ruthless brute, given to violent fits of insanity.
You've met him? Murtagh's eyes tightened.
Once, briefly. I still have scars from that encounter. These Urgals might not have been sent here for us, but I'm sure we've been seen by now and they'll follow us. Their chieftain isn't the sort to let a dragon escape his grasp, especially if he's heard about Gilead.
Eragon hurried to the fire and covered it with dirt. We have to flee. You don't want to go to the Varden, but I have to take Araya there before she dies. Here's a compromise. Come with me until I reach the lake, Koshna. Then we'll go our own way. Murtagh hesitated. Eragon added quickly, If you leave now, in sight of the column, Urgals will follow you. And then where will you be, facing them alone?
Very well, said Murtagh, tossing his saddlebags over Tornak's flanks. But when we near the Varden, I will leave.
Eragon burned to question Murtagh further, but not with the Urgals so near. He gathered his belongings and saddled Snowfire. Saphira fanned her wings, took off in a rush, and circled above. She kept guard over Murtagh and Eragon as they left camp. What direction shall I fly? She asked.
East, along the Boars.
Stilling her wings, Saphira rose on an updraft and teetered on the pillar of warm air, hovering in the sky over the horses. I wonder why the Urgals are here. Maybe they were sent to attack the Varden. Then we should try to avoid them, she said. He guided Snowfire past half-visible obstacles as the night deepened. The Urgals faded into the gloom behind them. Next chapter is A Clash of Wills. Let's see how long it is. And I think we'll read this one too. Alright. Chapter 48. A clash of wills. When morning came, Eragon's cheek was raw from chafing against Snowfire's neck, and he was sore from his fist fight with Murtagh. They had alternated sleeping in their saddles throughout the night. It allowed them to outdistance the Urgal troops, but neither of them knew if the lead could be retained. The horses were exhausted to the point of stopping, yet they still maintained a relentless pace. Whether it would be enough to escape depended on how rested the monsters were, and if Eragon and Murtagh's horses survived. The Boar Mountains cast great shadows over the land, stealing the sun's warmth. To the north was the Hadaric Desert, a thin white band as bright as noonday snow. "I must eat," said Saphira. "Days have passed since I last hunted. Hunger claws my belly. If I start now, I might be able to catch enough of those bounding deer for a few mouthfuls." Eragon smiled at her exaggeration. "Go if you must, but leave Araya here. I will be swift." He untied the elf from her belly and transferred her to Snowfire's saddle. Saphira soared away, disappearing in the direction of the mountains. Eragon ran beside the horses, close enough to Snowfire to keep Araya from falling. Neither he nor Murtagh intruded on the silence. Yesterday's fight no longer seemed important because of the Urgals, but the bruises remained. Saphira made her kills within the hour and notified Eragon of her success. Eragon was pleased that she would return so soon. Her absence made him nervous. They stopped at a pond to let the horses drink. Eragon idly plucked a stalk of grass, twirling it while he stared at the elf. He was startled from his reverie by a steep rasp of a sword being unsheathed. He instinctively grasped Zarok and spun around in search of an enemy. There was only Murtagh, his long sword held ready. He pointed at the hill ahead of them, where a tall, brown-cloaked man sat on a sorrel horse, mace in hand. Behind him was a group of 20 horsemen. No one moved.
"Could they be the Varden?"
asked Murtagh. Eragon surreptitiously strung his bow. "According to Araya, they're still scores of leagues away. This might be one of their patrols or raiding groups,
assuming they're not bandits."
Murtagh swung onto Tornak and readied his own bow. "Should we try to outrun them?" asked Eragon, draping a blanket over Araya. The horseman must have seen her, but he hoped to conceal the fact that she was an elf.
"It wouldn't do any good," said Murtagh, shaking his head. "Tornak and Snowfire are fine war horses, but they're tired and they aren't sprinters. Look at the horses those men have. They're meant for running. Besides, they would catch us before we're gone half a mile. Besides, they might have something important to say. You'd better tell Saphira to hurry back."
Eragon was already doing that. He explained the situation, then warned, "Don't show yourself unless it's necessary. We're not in the Empire, but I still don't want anyone to know about you." "Never mind that," she replied. "Remember, magic can protect you where speed and luck fail." He felt her take off and raced towards them, skimming close to the ground. The band of men watched them from the hill. Eragon nervously gripped Zarok. The wire-wrapped hilt was secured under his glove. He said in a low voice, "If they threaten us, I can frighten them away with magic. If that doesn't work, there's Saphira. I wonder how they'd react to a rider. So many stories have been told about their powers. It might be enough to avoid a fight."
"Don't count on it," said Murtagh flatly. "If there's a fight, we'll just have to kill enough of them to convince them we're not worth the effort."
His face was controlled and unemotional. The man on the sorrel horse signaled with his mace, sending the horsemen cantering towards them. The men shook javelins over their heads, whooping loudly as they neared. Battered sheaths hung from their sides. Their weapons were rusty and stained. 4 of them trained arrows on Eragon and Murtagh. Their leader swirled the mace in the air, and his men responded with yells and as they wildly encircled Eragon and Murtagh. Eragon's lips twitched. He almost loosed a blast of magic into their midst, then restrained himself. "We don't know what they want yet," he reminded himself, containing his growling apprehension. The moment Eragon and Murtagh were thoroughly surrounded, the leader reined in his horse, then crossed his arms and examined them critically. He raised his eyebrows.
"Well, these are better than the usual dregs we find. At least we got wealthy ones this time, and we didn't even have to shoot them. Greg will be pleased." The men chuckled. At his words, a sinking sensation filled Eragon's gut. A suspicion stirred in his mind. Saphira. "Now for the 2 of you," said the leader, speaking to Eragon and Murtagh. "If you would be so good as to drop your weapons, you will avoid being turned into living quivers by my men."
The archers grinned suggestively. The men laughed again. Murtagh's only movement was to shift his sword.
Who are you and what do you want? We are free men traveling through this land. You have no right to stop us.
Oh, I have every right, said the man contemptuously. And for my name, slaves do not address their masters in that manner unless they want to be beaten.
Eragon cursed to himself.
Slavers.
He remembered vividly the people he had seen at auction in Drasleona. Rage boiled within him. He glared at the men around him with new hatred and disgust. The lines deepened on their leader's face.
Throw down your swords and surrender.
The slavers tensed, staring at them with cold eyes as neither Eragon nor Murtagh lowered his weapon. Eragon's palm tingled. He heard a rustle behind him, then a loud curse. Startled, he spun around. One of the slavers had pulled the blanket off Araya, revealing her face. He gasped in astonishment, then shouted, "Tokenbrand, this one's an elf!" The men stirred with surprise while the leader spurred his horse over to Snowfire. He looked down at Araya and whistled.
Well, how much is she worth?
Someone asked. Tokenbrand was quiet for a moment, then spread his hands and said,
At the very least, fortunes upon fortunes. The Empire will pay a mountain of gold for her.
The slavers yelled with excitement and pounded each other on the back. A roar filled Eragon's mind as Saphira banked sharply overhead. "Attack now," he cried. "But let them escape if they run." She immediately folded her wings and plummeted downward. Eragon caught Murtagh's attention with a sharp signal. Murtagh took the cue. He smashed his elbow into the slaver's face, knocking the man out of his saddle, and jabbed his heels into Tornak. With a toss of his mane, the warhorse jumped forward, twirled around and reared. Murtagh brandished his sword as Tornak plunged back, driving his forehoofs into the back of a dismounted slaver. The man screamed. Before the slavers could gather to their senses, Eragon scrambled out of the commotion and raised his hands, invoking words of the ancient language. A globule of indigo fire struck the ground in the midst of a fray, bursting into a fountain of molten drops that dissipated like the sun-warmed dew. A second later, Saphira dropped from the sky and landed next to him. She parted her jaws, displaying her massive fangs, and bellowed.
"Behold!" cried Eragon over the fervor. "I am a rider!"
He raised Zarok over his head, the red blag dazzling in the sunlight. He pointed at the slavers.
"Flee if you wish to live."
The men shouted incoherently and scrambled over each other in their haste to escape. In the confusion, Tokenbrand was struck in the temple with a javelin. He tumbled to the ground, stunned. The men ignored their fallen leader and raced away in a ragged mass, casting fearful looks at Saphira. Tokenbrand struggled to his knees. Blood ran from his temple, branching across his cheek with crimson tendrils. Murtagh dismounted and strode over to him, sword in hand. Tokenbrand weakly raised his arm as to ward off the blow. Murtagh gazed at him coldly, then swung his blade at Tokenbrand's neck. "No!" shouted Eragon, but it was too late. Tokenbrand's decapitated trunk crumbled to the ground in a pile of dirt. His head lay with a hard thump. Eragon rushed to Murtagh, his jaw working furiously. "Is your brain rotten?" he yelled in rage. "Why did you kill him?" Murtagh wiped his sword on the back of Tokenbrand's jerkin. The steel left a dark stain.
"I don't see why you're so upset."
"Upset?" exploded Eragon. "I'm well past that. Did it ever occur to you that we could have just let them leave here and continued on our way? No, instead you turn into an executioner and chop off his head. He was defenseless." Murtagh seemed perplexed by Eragon's wrath.
"Well, we couldn't keep him around. He was dangerous. The others ran off. Without a horse, he wouldn't have made it far. Didn't want the Urgles to find him and learn about Araya, so I thought I would—"
"But to kill him?" interrupted Eragon. Saphira sniffed Tokenbrand's head curiously. She opened her mouth slightly, as if to snap it up, then appeared to decide better of it, and prowled to Eragon's side.
"I'm only trying to stay alive," stated Murtagh. "No stranger's life is more important than my own."
"But you can't indulge in wanton violence. Where's your empathy?" growled Eragon, pointing at the head.
"Empathy? Empathy. What empathy can I afford to my enemies? Shall I dither about whether to defend myself because it will cause someone pain? If that had been the case, I would have died years ago. You must be willing to protect yourself and what you cherish, no matter the cost."
Eragon slammed Zarok back into his sheath, shaking his head savagely.
"You can justify any atrocity with that reasoning."
"Do you think I enjoy this?" Murtagh shouted. "My life has been threatened from the day I was born.
All of my waking hours have been spent avoiding danger in one form or another, and sleep never comes easily because I always worry if I'll live to see the dawn. If there ever was a time I felt secure, it must have been in my mother's womb. Though I wasn't even safe there. You don't understand. If you lived with this fear, you would have learned the same lesson I did. Do not take chances. He gestured at Tokenbrand's body. He was a risk that I removed. I refuse to repent, and I won't plague myself over what is done and past. Eragon shoved his face into Murtagh's. It was still the wrong thing to do. He lashed Oriah to Saphira, then climbed onto Snowfire. Let's go. Murtagh guided Tornak around Tokenbrand's prone form in the blood-stained dust. They rode at a rate that Eragon would have thought impossible a week ago. Leagues melted away before them as if wings were attached to their feet. They turned south between two outstretched arms of the Boar Mountains. The arms were shaped like pincers about to close, the tips a day's travel apart. Yet the distance seemed less because of the mountain's size. It was as if they were in a valley made for giants. When they stopped for the day, Eragon and Murtagh ate dinner in silence, refusing to look up from their food. Afterwards, Eragon said tersely, I'll take the first watch. Murtagh nodded and lay on his blankets, with his back to Eragon. Do you want to talk? Asked Saphira. Not right now, murmured Eragon. Give me some time to think. I'm confused. She withdrew from his mind with a gentle touch and a whisper. I love you, little one. And I you, he said. She curled into a ball next to him, lending him her warmth. He sat motionless in the dark, wrestling with disquiet. That is the end of that chapter. And I will read the rest at a later date.